Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure that there will be a few other people settling in, but it seems appropriate that we go ahead and open this session. I don't know what number session it is, of course, for the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy. We do so many of these programs over the course of the year. I suspect somewhere between 15 and 20 by the time we're done. I will introduce our program tonight in the absence of our director, Professor Now, who is otherwise engaged this evening. I'm happy to take the opportunity to do so. It gives me the chance to say a word or two about the center, as I've been visiting this year, and I haven't had a chance to share with you the reaction to this particular experience. And so I do want to say that it has been a genuinely fruitful year. It is not over, of course, and so I do not mean to let anybody off the hook, students. But I do want you to know that it has proved for me, in the context of my overall career, especially invigorating. Very, very solid performance with the students I had throughout the fall, and have several very fine students now, and have received the most congenial welcome on the campus. About the center, for those of you who may not know, it exists here for a number of reasons, but perhaps none more significant than that of fostering a discourse that can surface what is certainly the most important of the university's missions, and that is to foster openness to conversation that is willing to take place in a context in which we don't insist upon guarantees that we won't be offended before we listen and participate. It is vitally important, not because of this or that particular speaker or this or that set of ideas. It's vitally important because the work that we in the Academy do is all premised on the assumption that we will show the hardihood to be able to stand and speak in every forum and to defend with arguments the positions that we take. The Center for Western Civilization is centered on fostering a wider appreciation for that disposition, not because it is a peculiar property of the center, but because through it, the center serves the special mission of the university. It's good to see that such an activity is appreciated here on the campus at Boulder. And it's good to see that there are people who understand that even when one has some special vulnerability, it is never going to be sufficient with regard to that vulnerability to close off conversation and indeed even argument. And so we ask people to go a long way, to take large steps in the direction of reaffirming our willingness to be vulnerable, at the same time that we assure our commitment never to exploit vulnerability. And it's in that kind of atmosphere, that environment, that we suspect we can most surely advance that discourse which will strengthen practices of civil reflection and build greater bonds of community across what might sometimes appear bonds of division. And you might think it odd to speak of bonds of division, but in my life I've discovered that people actually form a perverse kind of bond across their divisions. It doesn't help, but it does reinforce itself the more intensely they practice it. And so our job is to break down that practice and build up the other. We will have other presentations coming. The one that comes first to my mind will occur on April the 11th, when Mark Lilla will be here, and he will speak about identity and American national character. And therefore, we'll take yet another step in the series of conversations we have been having this year, and will doubtless continue to have into the future around this important dimension of our national discourse. At the end of this evening's presentation, we will, of course, be open to questions and answers, and we will practice on this occasion, and as we do on some, but as I do each time I get the opportunity, with deference to the undergraduate students to open the questioning. And so I want to say to the undergraduates who are here, be prepared because you will be the first to be called upon when we come to the question period. Well, I want to welcome Dr. James Piereson to be with us this evening to spend some time talking with us about what is his most recent book-length contribution to the discussion of American political life, and that is The Shattered Consensus. If you haven't read it, I will certainly recommend it to you. I read it when it first appeared, and it has in its own way figured very substantially in the work I have been doing for the last several years, as it turned out that our efforts were tracking in similar paths, and having taken up the project of American national character and seeking to expand the breadth of discussion of that particular issue, there are a number of works that have appeared. This is one of several of them I could name, and one of the most significant of those that have appeared. And they've given us all opportunity to revisit a question about why it is often so very difficult for us to contemplate that there even is such a thing as an American national character. Something that seems obvious to foreigners when they come among us, but seems utterly obscure to natives. So there's a question there that the Shattered Consensus will perhaps help us to advance our understanding of. But I want to first introduce Dr. Piereson, who is president and trustee of the William E. Simon Foundation, and that's a private grant-making foundation in New York City. Its interest in education, in religion, and of course in the problems of youth, which I want to emphasize. Mr. Piereson is also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Public Policy in New York City. Served previously as a president or executive director and trustee of the Olin Foundation, the John M. Olin Foundation. He did that for some 20 years. I think that's where I first met Jim, in fact. Despite the fact that I should have met him before, since he is an alumnus of that distinguished Midwestern University, where I spent several decades of my life. He came out of Michigan State University, and we have many friends in common. He's also on many, many nonprofit boards. He is, which include the Pinkerton Foundation, the Thomas W. Smith Foundation, the Center for Individual Rights. I could go at some length. He has written several things, books, articles. He writes for the Wall Street Journal, for Commentary, the New Criterion, the American Political Science Review. He's one of those political scientists whose practice of the art has carried him very broadly across many institutions and fields, and who, through it all, retained the, what might I call it, the hallmarks of the political scientist. And that's a rather important distinction to observe. You will know when you listen to him that he is, besides an accomplished contributor to this society, a political scientist. Jim?
Thank you very much, Bill. Appreciate it very much and delighted to be here. Thank you very much. Okay, don't worry about it. Thank you for that kind introduction. Well, I'm delighted to be here at the center. I think it's a wonderful institution at the University of Colorado. We need more such institutions around the country. I do my part to proliferate them to the extent I can. We need them very badly. I'm going to talk tonight about the subject of this book I published that Bill mentioned, Shattered Consensus. It's basically about the polarization that's taking place in the United States. I published this book 4 years ago, wrote it 5 years ago. It was a little bit ahead of its time. I did not foresee Donald Trump coming along. I think I did see that how to put it, the tinder was dry and was vulnerable to going up in flames, although I didn't exactly see how that was going to happen. In the meantime, my thinking has evolved somewhat on the subject in a more worrisome direction than I articulated in that book. And let me just talk about that tonight. I'm going to run you through a lot of slides and events of the post-war period in an effort to explain my views. The polarization is obviously real between the two political parties. I think they've gone from the point of disagreeing with one another to disliking one another, and that's not good. And as you proceed with the tit for tat, it tends to get worse. I do think there is an asymmetry there in the sense that increasingly Republicans disagree very strongly with Democrats, but Democrats seem increasingly to question even the legitimacy of Republicans. In other words, Republicans disagree with Democrats, but Democrats dislike Republicans. And as this proceeds, I think the Republican side will reciprocate. We've seen some troubling things said by people. I think I read today that one prominent Democrat has said that when they get power, they're going to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. That would only be the first step in a downward path because Republicans would retaliate when they get power, and pretty soon we'll have 100 members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and who knows what will happen then. A distinguished dean at the University of California Law School has said that the Supreme Court should outlaw the Electoral College. Why? Because it violates the one man, one vote principle the Supreme Court articulated in the reapportionment decisions of the 1960s. It's an interesting idea that Supreme Court precedents would trump a provision in the Constitution. Nevertheless, this is a distinguished dean, and he made a case for that. So you're seeing people suggest things that are not normally suggested in times of normal political controversy. And these are signs that things are moving in a very bad direction. Now, I have a general account of this. I don't know that it's correct. I'm going to go through some things tonight, and maybe I persuade you of this. I do not have a dogmatic view on this. I have a general view that the United States is beginning to unwind as a nation state. That's a pretty strong statement to make. Why do I say that? Let me just outline it very briefly here before I start. I think you can look at the history of the United States from the framing of the Constitution in terms of three long periods. That first period from 1787, with the ratification down to 1860 and the Civil War, was a period where the nature of this regime was contested. What kind of thing was this? Is this a union? Is it a federation? Jefferson called it an empire of liberty. The one thing they didn't call it was a nation. The idea of a nation had not really been developed yet. It was really developed in the context of the French Revolution. What's a nation? Well, the political scientists say that a nation is a political configuration where the state and the culture are basically the same. The state represents a people who are bound by a kind of a culture and principle. That's a nation state. As opposed to, say, the empires of old, which were very large configurations that consisted of many different political subgroupings. The Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and all the rest that all disintegrated in the 20th century. The United States is shaped into a nation in that roughly 100 years after the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was the architect of this. He talks about a nation in the Gettysburg Address and other speeches. And it was shaped by those three wars that the United States engaged in that period. If you looked at a map of the United States in 1850, you wouldn't think this was a nation. For example, its boundaries were not fixed. There were vast parts of the country that were unsettled. There were vast parts of the country that were occupied by hostile nations. There were two social systems at work that were hostile. Much of this, a significant part of it was acquired by conquest in a war with Mexico. So this was a thing that was starting to be shaped. Fast forward 100 years, and you can say in 1950 or 1945, this is a nation state. The American people are a people represented by its government, in the same sense that France is a nation state. They'd gone through three very large events: the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression in between. These were all communal events. Everybody participated in them. People died. And out of those communal events, this nation was formed. So I'm now going to talk about the post-war period, because the United States enters the post-war period with tremendous momentum as a nation state. It now becomes a superpower. It now has a very large government and a very large national security apparatus and a military that we'd never had before. The United States had never before had a significant standing army until after World War II. It was never thought that the United States had substantial international responsibilities, but now with the Cold War, it did. So Henry wrote this very significant article in Life magazine in 1941 where he envisioned an American century. That is to say, this is before the United States got into the war, but he thought the United States should get into the war, and he felt that the United States should shape the world in line with democracy and freedom, and that would be the American contribution to the world. Of course, the United States comes out of the war as really the only dominant power in the West that's still functioning. Those are just some numbers that illustrate the U.S. share of world gross domestic product. 1945, it's close to 40% of world GDP. Why? Europe and Japan are totally on their back. And through that early part of the post-war period, the United States is supplying all the industrial goods, automobiles, coal, steel, appliances, to get the European countries back on their feet. Now, there is a tendency for Americans to look back on that period to think that that was normal. But in fact, it was an aberrational period due to the war and the fact that all of our competitors were not really competing very strongly because they're basically out of business because of the war. So you developed in the 1950s a very strong consensus in America around economic growth, around the need for the United States to stand up in the world against communism, to deter the Soviet Union, to build up its military, all organized around very strong families. The baby boom generation, we still talk about it. That's the birth rate in the post-war period, which increases very rapidly from the end of the war into the 1960s. So the baby boom generation is that generation born between 1946 and 1963 or 1964. You can see the birth rate is very high, 4.5 million babies born every year in that period, and the high point from the early 50s to the early 60s. Roughly 80 million members of the baby boom generation, maybe some are here tonight. And they've gone through the system, creating their own problems as they've moved through the system. By comparison, I think the millennials, so-called, who were born in the 80s and 90s, they're almost as large as the baby boomers. 71 million or something like that. I don't have the exact numbers. The birth rate in America now is relatively low. The United States is increasing its population mainly by immigration, not by its birth rate. But as I'll point out in a moment, the immigration rate was extremely low in the 50s and 60s. Population grew by birth rate. So the average age of the population in 1955 was 27. The average age today is 39. It's actually more than that. So we have an aging population as a consequence of these things. So the population is growing rapidly. We have television. which comes in the 1950s. Almost no one had a television set in 1950. Everyone has a television set in 1960. There are 3 television networks that provide the news. Everybody gets the same news from the same people in the same way. Obviously, this is the kind of thing that will encourage a consensus in the country. No Fox, no Rush Limbaugh, none of that. So in the election of 1960, you have Kennedy and Nixon who campaign, and people are struggling to find differences between these two. And Nixon says, well, you agree on everything, we just differ a little bit on the means. Kennedy was actually much more of a cold warrior than Nixon. Blamed the Eisenhower administration for the Cuban Revolution, and claimed that the Russians had taken the lead in missiles, and the United States was at a disadvantage there. So Kennedy ran to the right of Nixon. But, you know, basically, they didn't really differ all that much. And one of Kennedy's supporters, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., wrote a book on this in which he couldn't find any substantive differences. And he said the real difference between the two was in their personality. Kennedy gave off an aura of energy and excitement. That was the main difference between the two. And that's why Kennedy should be elected. He would give some more energy to the country, which was lagging under the almost 80-year-old Dwight David Eisenhower. The Kennedys were celebrities in that period. Kennedy, obviously Jacqueline Kennedy is beautiful, and they had these beautiful children, and they were very popular, and the Kennedys became celebrities. And Kennedy discovered that he could use celebrity to augment his political popularity very successfully. Indeed, he hung out with Hollywood stars and starlets and to reinforce that sense of celebrity that Kennedy had. One could never imagine Richard Nixon or General Eisenhower hanging out with Hollywood stars and starlets. It never would have occurred to him. But it did occur to the Kennedys. Civil rights, obviously a big issue. This is Martin Luther King at the Washington Monument, a huge demonstration in August of 1963, 500,000 people there demonstrating to pass a civil rights bill that Kennedy had introduced. Martin Luther King gives this great speech. There's a quotation there from it, probably the greatest American speech in the post-war period that Martin Luther King gives on this occasion, and it gives a big push to the civil rights movement at that time, at a time of an enormous amount of violence across the South directed at civil rights workers. People are assassinated and beaten up and so on, a lot of that. So that's Martin Luther King. And that's, of course, the assassination of President Kennedy, which happens just a few months after Martin Luther King gives that talk. So, you know, this is a horrible event. No one expected it. A very young president, vital president, a young family, shot down on the streets of Dallas, riding in a convertible. We don't do that anymore, send our presidents around in convertibles through city streets. But we did then. And we see the results. So this was a huge national shock to the American psyche to have something like this happen. And the presidential funeral was also a national event. Work was canceled, schools were canceled. Everybody watched on television. The televisions ran nonstop for 3 days, no commercials, talking about this event, replaying this event. Anyone who lived through it could never forget all these images that they saw in this period, the little children out in front of the church and so on. This was, I think you could call this a communal event that everyone participated in, albeit of a kind of a negative and a shocking one. The thing was rendered more confusing by the fact that no one could explain the assassination. Who shot Kennedy? Well, the assassin was a man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, identified in the Warren Report. The evidence against him was overwhelming. I could go through it, but it's tedious. Oswald had defected. He was a young Marine, 24 years old. He left the Marines and defected to the Soviet Union. When he defected, he said he was going to give away American secrets that he'd learned in the Marine Corps. And he disappeared in the Soviet Union for 3 years and then came back to the United States in 1962, disillusioned with the Soviet Union, but a fervent admirer of Fidel Castro and Castro's revolution. And he marched and passed out leaflets for Castro and created a phony organization in support of Castro. And he had an opportunity to shoot Kennedy, and he did. However, the assassination was interpreted by the leadership of the country, that is, those 3 television networks and the major newspapers, as an event in the civil rights movement, when in fact it was an event in the Cold War. Why? Well, because Dallas, where this happened, was a very right-wing city full of anti-communists and bigots who opposed the civil rights movement. And they protested Kennedy's appearance in Dallas. And as a consequence of that environment, they said that they had caused the assassination, Dallas had, when in fact a communist shot President Kennedy. This created enormous confusion in the United States as to how to interpret this event, because no one could come to terms with it. Of course, it didn't make a lot of sense that a communist should shoot the president in Dallas, of all places. But that's in fact what happened, made worse by the fact the assassin is himself killed in police custody a couple days later, so there would be no trial. And this had to be rendered coherent in a report by the Warren Commission, which played down the communist aspect of it and played up Oswald's personal characteristics. He didn't get along with his wife, he couldn't keep a job, and so on. But of course, a militant communist is going to have trouble keeping a job, getting along with his wife, and all the rest of it. So we did then wrestle for the rest of that period with the Kennedy assassination. It was never a settled event. And many people blame the United States for it. It's this climate of hate and violence in the United States that caused this horrible event. This may have been one of the first times we began to see this negative attitude toward the United States in response to an event like this. So this is now hanging in the background of the 1960s. Now, kind of the idea that I have here about our polarization is that in the post-war period, which begins with this consensus, we have had 2 revolutions. We had the revolution of the 1960s, which I'm now discussing, somewhat kicked off by the Kennedy assassination, which is a shock to the psyche of the United States, that something like this could happen, and we continue to debate it and ruminate over it. But it's only the beginning. More things happen. Lyndon Johnson gets a big civil rights bill passed in 1964, using Kennedy's martyrdom as a basis for it, saying that Kennedy was a martyr to civil rights, and as a consequence of that, we should pass this major civil rights bill, which we do in 1964 with Johnson's leadership. But this just reinforces this idea that Kennedy was a martyr to civil rights, when in fact, it was more of an event in the Cold War. Johnson wins a landslide election in 1964, again with the Kennedy assassination in the background. Gets a tremendous majority in the Senate and the House and uses that majority to pass the Great Society. So this is a very large political event that now happens in the United States. So Medicare and Medicaid, he immediately passes in 1965. Medicare, federal insurance for the elderly over 65, Medicaid, health care for the poor below the poverty line. Medicare paid for with a payroll tax, just like Social Security. I think it's an amendment to the Social Security Act. Medicaid paid for by a split between federal revenues and state revenues. States set them up and the federal government reimburses the states. So when Barack Obama advanced his Obamacare proposal, basically what he did was expand Medicaid. the health insurance program for the poor. He basically said, Medicaid is for people below the poverty line. And he said, but there are a lot of people who are uninsured who have incomes above the poverty line. Let's go 33% above the poverty line and let those people come into Medicaid. So it's no longer a program just for the poor, but for people who have incomes above the poverty level, but who don't have health insurance. And the federal government will pay 90% of this increment, and the states will pay 10% as a bribe to bring them in. So that was a big chunk of Obamacare. And of course, now we're hearing Democratic candidates say Medicare for all. Now, it was said that Medicare was socialism. It really wasn't, because the government didn't employ the doctors or own the hospitals. The federal government reimbursed the private providers, the doctors, the hospitals, the pharmaceutical companies, and so on. So the elderly go get medical care from a doctor or hospital, and they then submit the bill to Medicare, who send the check to the providers. So that was how it was set up, and that's how this is being envisioned today. So I guess my point here is that a lot of the reforms we're seeing today, the foundations of these were laid in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson. But this is the growth of Medicaid enrollments to 2015, 70 million people on Medicaid in 2015. There are about 75 million today. In 4 or 5 years, it'll be about 80 or 85 million. A lot of the growth due to Obamacare. Probably 15 to 20 million of this is, by the time it's over with, Obamacare. Now, you do the math, 80 million people on Medicaid, population of 310, 320 million people, that's over a third of the country on Medicaid. That's a big number. And it's a big expense for the states, and an exploding expense for the states. Medicare enrollments, the last one I had was 2013, 52 million. It's 61 million today on Medicare. And that's rising because those baby boomers are now retiring. And that number is probably going to go up to 70 or 75 million in 10 years. So now that's a different population than Medicaid. So if you have 75 million people on Medicare and 80 million people on Medicaid, different people, add that up, I got 150 million people. That's half the country on either Medicare or Medicaid. Who's paying for it? Well, everybody in the workforce, but the people pulling the wagon, it's getting harder and harder to pull that wagon with more and more people in it. But 1965, all this begins. And then the third thing that was done, and this is very large, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Again, Johnson did this. The United States in 1924 passed a very restrictive immigration bill. And it said that we were going to favor immigration from the northern European countries and Canada. So Canada, Great Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, a few others, and we're going to disfavor immigration from Southern Europe. Immigration from Asia was forbidden. And there is very little immigration from the South. So they removed all those restrictions and repealed the 1924 Act and got rid of the nationality restrictions. When they sued Trump over the travel ban, they used the Immigration Act of 1965 because we banned nationality and ethnic tests in immigration policy under the 1965 Act. But partly as a consequence of that act, you can kind of see what's happened to immigration. So immigration in the United States peaked in the early part of the century. Those are the percentages of immigrants in the population of the United States. So definition of an immigrant is a person born in another country living in the United States. So in 1900, about 15% of our 90 million or so were foreign born, almost all from Europe. And by 1960, 1970, you can see this has gone down to 4% in a population of 180, 200 million, a very small number of immigrants. Now that number starts to go up, as you can see. So now we're back to where we were at the turn of the century, 15% or so. There are about 50 million immigrants in the United States today. That does not include their children, who, if they're born in the United States, are American citizens. That's it started to be a big number. That's one of the things that's kind of behind the whole Trump phenomenon. But that's a very interesting pattern that you see. So immigration kind of stops in the middle part of the century. Why? Well, the Great Depression is one thing, the Immigration Act of 1924 is another, and World War II is another. So it's one of the things that contributed to the consensus of that period, the stability of that period. And you can see the differences between the immigrants in 1960 and those today. In 1960, 84% came from Europe and Canada. In 2013, 14% came from Canada and Europe. So it's a complete flip in the nature of our immigration system in that period of time, essentially attributable to the 1965 Act. Vietnam, we know all about Vietnam. The Kennedy Doctrine said that we were too focused on Europe, East-West, nuclear deterrence. The theater of the Cold War had now moved to the Third World. It's these peasant revolutions that are the future of the Cold War, and the United States has to combat these revolutions in places like Cuba, in China, and Africa, and in places like Vietnam. And we need to train special forces to fight there. So Lyndon Johnson escalates the war, and by 1968 has 550,000 American troops there, and we lose close to 60,000 Americans in that war, which we would eventually lose in Vietnam. But the Cold War was framed as a global conflict, as a consequence of which the United States was going to fight anywhere. And so during the Cold War, we fought in Korea, in Vietnam, and had troops in other places as well. But very unpopular. By 1966, 1967, the country's in flames over the war in Vietnam in opposition to it. The college campuses are aflame with it. So the foreign policy consensus in the 1950s is now being blown apart by the war in Vietnam. And 10 years earlier, even Lyndon Johnson we could have never imagined that he would have had this kind of opposition to a foreign conflict, but very quickly it happened. Again, this is partly the baby boom aspect of it. These baby boomers are now in college and they're of draft age and so on. And then we have urban unrest, racial unrest in the northern cities. Started in 1965 with a major riot in Los Angeles, and we have maybe a couple hundred between 1965 and 1968 or 69 in all of our big cities, just about. Often set off by a confrontation between a police officer and a young black man, which then explodes into a full-fledged riot. But of course, the whole civil rights movement was directed to the South, the problems in the South. Now suddenly, we've got this situation in the northern cities where blacks have begun to move. And there's no obvious answer to this. You could address the civil rights issue in the South by passing the Civil Rights Bill, but what exactly are we supposed to do with this? So the civil rights consensus now begins to blow up in the mid to late 1960s. And then you had what we'd call the cultural revolution of the kids, which goes hand in hand with the political revolution I just described. So sex, drugs, and rock and roll. A lot of kids are dropping out of school. A lot of music is made about taking drugs. Movies are made about taking drugs. And kids drop out. And in a sense, they're rebelling against the conformity of the 1950s. They don't want to get out of school and get a job and get married and have kids and retire at age 65. They want a more exciting and interesting life. The Cold War consensus was boring, and they wanted something more interesting, and that's sort of what happened in the 1960s. There were two sides of the 1960s because not everybody joined in these crusades. The United States made enormous technological advances in the 1960s. Some people have talked about the distinction between Dionysius and Apollo, the ancient Greek gods. Dionysius, the god of pleasure, Apollo, the god of rationality and science. Well, the United States named its space program the Apollo program, And with the goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This is President Kennedy, and bringing him home safely again. So this whole revolution in science goes hand in hand with, on the other side of it, this cultural and political revolution. One great irony is that the sexual revolution, so-called, was made possible by science. G.D. Searle discovered a birth control pill in the late 1950s, tested it, and began to market it in the mid-1960s. And by the late 1960s, the birth control pill was widely used, so even really starting in the mid-1960s. And this really formed the basis of the sexual revolution and a lot of things that have happened in relations between men and women since that time. But it was born out of science. 1968, it was a very bad year. A lot of this comes to a culmination. Martin Luther King is now shot in Memphis. He's there to aid some workers in a labor strike. April 4th, 1968, the election is underway. Johnson's pulled out. Bobby Kennedy's in the race. The assassin is caught a couple months later in London carrying a couple of different passports. I've never been satisfied as to the explanation for all this, as to how that happened. It's very suspicious. If we'd given as much attention to this event as to the John F. Kennedy assassination, we might have explained it better. Then 2 months later, Kennedy himself is shot. On the evening of the California primary, which he's just won, after he's given his victory speech. And he's shot in I think the kitchen area where he's leaving, by a Palestinian national who's upset because he heard Kennedy speak in favor of Israel and selling American jets to Israel. And he decided Kennedy had to be killed. This assassination, like the John F. Kennedy's assassination, was framed as a civil rights event, when in fact it was an event in American foreign policy. American policy toward the Middle East is what inspired Sirhan to shoot Senator Kennedy, adding somewhat to the whole confusion of the period. So from 1963 to 1968, we have a very stable country with the post-war consensus that we're talking about, to a country that's gone crazy in a short period of 5 years. The kids are on drugs, the campuses are inflamed, the cities are aflame. We've had 3 major national leaders assassinated. We're in an unpopular war. It's not good. Hubert Humphrey's nominated as a Democratic candidate. A lot of opposition to him because he's Lyndon Johnson's vice president and thought he's going to continue the war, rioting outside the Democratic convention in Chicago in 1968. All televised. People are watching it inside the convention hall. They fight about it inside the convention. The Democratic convention ends in shambles. And by the time they take polls a week later, Humphrey's about 20 points behind Nixon. He eventually closes that gap, but still loses. Postscript to the 60s, to this upheaval of the 1960s, of the first revolution, is Hillary Rodham. This is her graduation photo from Wellesley College in 1969. She was chosen by the students at Wellesley to give the commencement address on behalf of the students. The formal address was given by Edward Brooke, the senator from Massachusetts, who in the course of his remarks says that there's no excuse for working outside the system to bring about change, using violence and so on, because in a democratic society, you can achieve that peacefully. Hillary Rodham disagrees with this in her speech, upbraids Senator Brooke and says, we're tired of waiting, we want change now. This story is covered in national newspapers. I have a story from the New York Times on this. She was from Chicago and it was covered in Chicago. So she becomes famous. I mean, we think that Hillary Clinton kind of came out of nowhere with Bill Clinton. No, she was a factor at the end of the 1960s. There's our Donald Trump, who is on the other side of the 1960s. He's not involved in any demonstrations or protests or drugs or anything like that. He goes to a military academy, then goes to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania to study real estate, and a few years later, his father appoints him president of his real estate company. So Donald Trump, kind of as wild and crazy as he is today, had a very conventional youth. It really, compared to Hillary, Rodham. So 1969, the United States puts a man on the moon. That's a tremendous achievement. Probably, in the history of mankind, one of the great achievements of all time, sending a man to the moon, taking photographs and movies and bringing that man back. Tremendous scientific, technical achievement that the United States does in the 1960s by all these scientists and engineers. You've seen the movies. They're all wearing short-sleeved white shirts with slide rules in their pockets. These guys were on the other side of the 1960s. You can make a case that these guys were real heroes because of what they achieved compared to some of the other people. But I won't make that argument. So that's Apollo 11. I gather there's a documentary just out on Apollo 11. I'm going to go and see that. I gather it's very good. So this was, an amazing thing that we did. Some of you may have seen the space capsule at the Smithsonian. Just a bunch of tinfoil, it looks like. I don't know how the heck they ever did that. And then a few weeks later, Dionysius, the Woodstock Festival, which you've all read about. They expected 50,000 people, young people, to a rock concert in upstate New York with a lot of very big acts, rock stars, 20, 30 of them, a lot of them. Instead, they got 500,000. They totally overwhelmed the place. They broke down the fences. They couldn't take tickets. They had to let everyone in. They clogged the New York State Thruway. And they didn't have enough food for them, no medical supplies for them, totally overwhelming. It rained, kids were sick, drug overdoses, babies were born there. The National Guard had to airlift people in and out, airlift food in, and so on. But that was the big communal event on that side. Now you could ask yourself, we talked about communal events, these wars. Everybody participates. They bring people together. They solidify the country. What are the communal events of the 1960s? It's mainly this sort of thing. The soldiers who went to Vietnam, they came back disillusioned. They didn't come back to celebrations and parades and all that. A lot of them were, if not vilified, ignored when they came back from the war in Vietnam. The real communal event of the 1960s was this sort of thing. The demonstrations, the cultural events, the rock festivals, this sort of thing. So you have this thing, this whole event breaking up the post-war consensus on the cultural side, and this whole thing locates itself eventually in the Democratic Party. The women's rights movement begins in the late 60s. It's an add-on to the civil rights movement. The women activists see, well, look, if African Americans can have these rights and are protesting and achieve things, we can do it too. Why not? And so that begins. And so does the gay rights, gay pride movement in 1969 in New York. Both of these things continue to unfold, as we know. We see it happening. They may have gone about as far as they can go, but they seem to find ways to continue to extend them. I think the gay rights movement was derailed for a time by the AIDS crisis and then gathered its momentum later. So these things are born in the 1960s and continue to unfold, as I say. They found their home in the Democratic Party, which makes this case for these developments. After the 1968 convention, the Democratic Party put in place a committee to make their conventions more representative. And they said, this committee, that in the future, all delegates to the conventions had to be representative of the important groups in society. So they had to represent women and African Americans and youth and other ethnic groups were in there. They did not include the gay issue, but eventually that gets in there later. But they basically say that their party now has to represent these groups in terms of their proportion in the population, and they have to be delegates to the conventions that are selecting presidents. And that begins in 1972. The candidate lost that year, but that has been an aspect of Democratic Party conventions. And as you look around today and you watch the Democratic Party begin to nominate its president, this identity issue seems to be front and center to all of their discussions. It starts at this time. The second revolution of the post-war period is the market revolution of the 1980s. So we talk about cultural and political revolution of the 1960s. The 80s is an economic and market revolution. It's also, to use the word loosely, libertarian, in the sense that it wants to free up business and entrepreneurs to invent and innovate and create jobs by eliminating regulation and reducing taxes. Starts in Great Britain because of labor strikes. Great Britain's economy is pretty much on its back in the 1970s. We have an Iranian hostage crisis in 1979 that embarrasses Jimmy Carter, which you know all about. That's the beginning of the Ayatollah and the radical regime there. And we have inflation and unemployment very high in the 1970s. Inflation and unemployment are not supposed to happen together. They're supposed to work reciprocally. Inflation goes up, unemployment is supposed to go down, and vice versa. But as you can see from the chart, they're both moving up together. And this is a kind of a crisis that challenges what's called the Keynesian consensus of the post-war period, that the government can manage economic growth through spending and by running calculated deficits, but obviously it's not able to do that. And so a new approach was needed. Had the gasoline lines as account of the wars in the Middle East. The Arab countries unleashed what they called the sword of oil in response to American support for Israel and put an embargo on us and begin to set the prices and ration the prices for oil, creating gas shortages and very high oil prices and gasoline prices in the American economy. Those are photos of gas lines in the late 1970s. Margaret Thatcher is elected Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1979 to privatize and reform the economy, which she does heavily, by reforming labor unions and selling off government-owned properties. I've listed some of them: British Petroleum, British Telecom, Jaguar, British Airways. They're all privatized. Pope is also now chosen here, the first non-Italian Pope in 1979, who makes it his priority to challenge communism in Eastern Europe. And Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980 in a landslide because of the troubles that Jimmy Carter is having with the economy, the hostage crisis, the gas lines, and all the rest. The other personality here is Paul Volcker, who Jimmy Carter appoints as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board to deal with inflation. And Paul Volcker comes in 1979. So all these things are happening at once. Thatcher, Reagan, the Pope, Volcker. Because interest rates are climbing through the 1970s, and by 1980, the federal funds rate set by the Federal Reserve Board is about 19%. Mortgages are 21, 22%. Inflation is running 15% or something like that, going up. You can't run an economy with interest rates at 20%. Who's going to buy a house with mortgages at 21%? It's not possible. That's what Paul Volcker did as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board to squeeze inflation out of the system. That's how you do it. You raise interest rates. That's what he did. And you can see from 1980 onward, interest rates have continued to come down, and that's created a benign economic environment for us with all these very low interest rates. Federal funds rate went to almost zero after the financial crisis. It's now around 2%. still extremely low by historical standards. But that did create a recession in 1981 and 1982, and we had 11% unemployment in 1982. It was felt that Ronald Reagan was not going to succeed because of that. But he cut taxes, cut the highest tax rate from 70% to 50%, then down to 28%, cut all tax brackets, cut the corporate rate to encourage investment and job creation. In 1981, just at the time the economy was tanking. But it took a couple years for that to take hold, and the economy in 1983 and 84 began to grow very rapidly. 1984, GDP grew by 7.2%, as you can see there on the left-hand side. 1983, 4.5%, and that got Reagan reelected in a landslide. So, we haven't had 7% growth in a year since 1984. So that was a big improvement. And then it stabilizes through the 1980s. But we've solved the interest rate and the inflation problem, and we've got the economy growing again. That's a chart of inflation. You can see it's kind of interesting, the cycle of inflation. It goes up gradually, starting in 1945, goes up, goes up, goes up, peaks in about 1980, and then starts going down. And again, that's an aspect of the benign economic environment we're living in, low interest rates and low inflation. Reagan raised defense spending. Those are kind of the waves of defense spending. The one in the middle reflects the Reagan buildup. He cut some other programs, kept them stable, raised defense spending to challenge the Soviet Union. That's a familiar story. Now, the big thing, I think, that's happened in the 1980s, and that is a dominant factor today, is the stock market boom. So that shows you the Dow Jones Industrial Average across the century. And you can see it's pretty flat until about 1980. I think the Dow Jones Industrial Average is around 750 in 1981. The Dow Jones, American stock market in 1980, in real inflation-adjusted terms, is about the same as it was in 1929, before the crash. So you have 50 years in which the US stock market doesn't grow at all in real inflation-adjusted terms. And now it begins to take off, almost straight up. The Dow is now 26,000. It's had a few blips along the way, but we had a bull market in the 1920s that lasted 4 years, from 1925 to 1929. People thought that was amazing. And then we had the crash. This thing has been going on since 1982. So do the math, that's 37 years of a gigantic stock market boom. Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of the world. The amount of wealth that's been created in the US stock market since the early 1980s. I guess as a result of these low interest rates and low inflation and some of the tax favorability of investing in financial assets. I don't have a good explanation as to why all this happened. Those are some of the factors, but this is a huge event in the post-war period, the growth in the stock market. People have benefited from it. Anybody who owns pension funds and all the rest, IRAs, has benefited from it. There's a movie from the 1980s. We talk about cultural changes. Business is basically really on the run in the 1960s. College kids wanted nothing to do with business. By the 1980s, this has all changed. Business, making money, stock market, this is all now good. You've all seen the speech, Gordon Gekko's speech from Wall Street. Globalization really begins in this period. In the 60s and 70s, exports and imports are maybe 5 to 10% of US economy. Now it's about 30%. So now the world economy begins to be integrated. We're trading all over the world. China, India enters the international economy. These are all big events that contribute to the stock market. This is very interesting. This is distribution of wealth, distribution of income. So that's the percentage of national income that goes to the top 1% of income earners. So as you can see, at the beginning of the century, 1900, 1910, 1920s. The wealthiest were taking 18, 20% of national income. The top 1% takes 20% of national income. And then from the 1930s, after the crash and the New Deal, very high tax rates, 91% marginal tax rates in the 30s and 40s and 50s. That percentage goes down to 8% in the middle decades, between 1950 and 1980. It really craters. And now, beginning with this market revolution of the 80s, it reverses. And so now the top 1%, as of this year, we're probably talking 20% of national income. Of course, that's now become an issue in the political sphere. Tax the rich, pay for this, that, and the other thing. Because as this has happened, the salaries and wages of all the other workers have not grown anywhere near as quickly, which is creating a political problem. But in my assessment, this is very closely related to the stock market boom of the 1980s. Who owns stocks? Wealthy people. Real estate, wealthy people. So naturally, in stock market booms, there's going to be that discrepancy. So this is a big factor of the market revolution. A lot of it is propelled by debt. These are the numbers I take from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Board. That's the amount of credit market debt in the American economy. Credit market debt is all debt, government, household and consumer, and corporate debt, and state and local government debt. It now adds up to $70 trillion on a GDP of about $20 trillion. Now, from 1950 to 1980, credit market debt was roughly the same as GDP. And beginning in the 1980s, credit market debt begins to go up. Now, to the point now we're at $70 trillion, $20 trillion in the US federal government, about $4 trillion in state and local governments, $16 trillion in mortgages, 20 trillion or so in corporate debt, I think. So there's debt throughout the system. Stock markets love debt. People can buy and so on. So we have a very highly leveraged economy. Now, partly as a consequence of those low interest rates. You have low rates, people borrow, go into debt, they can handle the debt. What happens if interest rates go up? We'll have a problem. We might not be able to service that debt. If interest rates went up from where they are now, 2% or so on the federal funds rate, to 6 or 8%, that would be bad. So let's hope that that benign environment continues, because we're somewhat dependent upon it. And as a coda, if Woodstock was a coda to the 1960s, the collapse of communism is a coda to the 1980s and the market revolution, as communism collapses, first in Eastern Europe, then proceeding to the Soviet Union, and the Cold War is over. A startling development that no one ever thought would happen, certainly not as fast as that happened. That's the revolution in Poland in 1989. The Pope is given a great deal of credit for this uprising, and Ronald Reagan as well. That's the spread of it, culminating in Russia and the Soviet Union in 1991. So the Soviet Union, I guess, is the last empire to fall of the 20th century. 20th century is a century where empires collapsed and fell, starting with World War I, more after World War II, now the Soviet Empire. In my opinion, a total folly to think that you could implement a socialist government over such a vast empire and land area. It did survive 70 years. It didn't survive all that long into what I would call the modern period, like post-1970, when those pressures of globalization began. It didn't last very long. America is now, again, the great superpower, even more so than it was in 1945, in the 1990s. Okay, so now we get to this big thing. So why, after all these achievements, why should there be such polarization in our politics? I guess my thought here is that we've just discussed two revolutions of different kinds. the cultural and political and welfare state revolution of the 60s, the market revolution of the 1980s, they were driven by two different parties, and they eventually landed in different parties. The revolution of the 1960s lands in the Democratic Party, and the revolution of the 1980s lands in the Republican Party, and they continue to pursue the ideals of these two revolutions down to the present time. I'm just suggesting that these two streams now proceed through the 90s and down to the present time, and has helped to polarize the two parties and polarize our politics. Both very important developments. That is actually, it's not polarization, it's a measure of trust in government that's taken by surveys. Do you trust the federal government to do the right thing? So in 1960, you can see it's very high, and you can see why it would be high then. The government's won the World War II, invented the atomic bomb, is now sending these missiles into space, built the Federal Highway Project, built all these universities and schools. It's achieved a great deal. But as we've asked government to do more and more things, our trust in government and belief in government has begun to wane. I saw a number recently that today, that number, it says 26%. That's about 3 years ago. It's now about 17 or 18% in the latest Gallup surveys. That is the number of people who say they can trust the federal government to do what is right most of the time. This is very interesting here. I'm going to give you three maps: the presidential election of 96, 08, and 2016. You could interpolate in between as a measure of polarization. So that top one is a presidential election of 96, Clinton versus Dole. The red boxes are counties that Dole, the Republican, won by more than 20%. The blues are the boxes that Clinton won by more than 20%. And the white boxes are counties that were competitive, in which one or the other won by less than 20%. That's not real competitive, but it's a measure of competition. So you have a big part of the chunk of the country that's competitive. Those are all counties in white that are competitive, that either party could win, if they ran the right candidate and had the right circumstances. So that's 96. So this is 2008, fast forward. Now this is Obama versus McCain. Relatively close election. And you see those white boxes receding. There are fewer of them. And the red and the blue expanding. In other words, the competitive districts are receding. So let's go to 2016, if you just kind of keep these in mind. That's 2016. So all those red areas are counties that Trump won by more than 20%. There are not a lot of kind of white counties out there that are competitive. And then you see the blues that are basically coastal and urban that the Democrats carry. So Republicans seem to control a great deal of the land mass of the continent, and Democrats, the cities, especially around the coast, looking outward to the global economy. And there's no reason to think that that's not going to continue going forward into the next election. That's the congressional election results of 2018. Now, the Democrats did very well, but the red are all the counties or districts that Republicans won, and the blues are all the ones that Democrats won, and they did very well. But what you're starting to see is two different countries here. Red nation and blue nation. And maybe red nation, a lot of people have different interpretations of this. Maybe red nation formed more by that revolution of the 80s. Blue nation, that continuing revolution from the 1960s. The problem is you can have a country that works fairly well if people disagree with one another. It gets very difficult if you have a country where people really dislike one another and hate one another. And that seems to be where we're going, because now you can't get anything done. And you start talking about abolishing the Supreme Court or packing the Supreme Court or getting rid of the Electoral College. Why? So we can win. That's the most important thing, that we win. Because if you win, we're dead. So we can't let the other guys win. And that's a situation that the United States has rarely been in the past. Usually the other guys win. You know, they're not going to take everything from you, and you negotiate, and there are checks and balances in the system, and they're not that far apart. But now when you get the idea that when one side wins, it's a complete win, and the other side loses, they have to go home, it's all over for them. You have a bad situation in a country, and that's kind of where we're starting to tend. You know, I don't need to go on this point. I've talked long enough. That's a survey that was done after the 2016 election, where they've pinpointed voters according to their opinions. So the top right-hand corner, all those red dots, those are Trump voters. And those are people who are socially conservative and economically conservative. In other words, they don't want a lot of government regulation, and they believe in traditional values. The lower left is where the Democrats are. They're culturally liberal, and they're economically liberal. They want government programs, they want more spending, and therefore a whole series of rights. So you can see that Republican voters and Democratic voters cluster in these different boxes. There's not a lot of overlap between them. Now, in this bottom right-hand corner, that would be, I think, the corner that would be both economically and socially libertarian. You want free markets, and you want everybody to do whatever they want, culturally. There's nobody there. There are no voters there. You can't win an election there. There's a lot of temptation for Republicans to play to that corner. But Donald Trump kind of understood that's not where the voters are, and you're not going to win an election there. But this is another way of saying these parties are starting to polarize along all axes, economic and cultural. This is just another measure from 1994 to the present. Again, polls that are taken of attitudes of Republicans and Democrats, where they try to locate them on these scales, and they just find out that ideologically they're moving further and further apart. That's of all voters. When you look at the same chart of activists, it's really wider still. The activists on the Democratic side are way left, and the activists on the Republican side are way left. And those are the ones who shape the parties. Another way of saying the same thing, that the Democrats are moving further left, Republicans further right. A lot more antipathy between the parties. So in 1994, let's see, how does that work? So 16% of Democrats had an unfavorable or very unfavorable opinion of Republicans in 94. By 2017, it's 44%. So more and more Democrats have a highly unfavorable opinion of Republicans. And you get the same thing on the Republican side, looking back at Democrats. So these two parties increasingly don't like one another. And it's no surprise that they're having a problem getting along with one another. Pride in America in decline. That's sad to see. This is a survey just taken recently. A majority of only one state can pass a citizenship test. And these are basic tests. How many senators are there? How many states are there? What's the Bill of Rights? That sort of thing. So they did a big survey, and only Vermont had a majority of the respondents passing the citizenship test. So our immigrants who have to pass this test know more about America than the natives do. So we come to the twilight of the American century. That's kind of the question that Henry Luce raised the question in 1941, and certainly it has been a dominant theme of the post-war period. It would look like something important is happening out there. I guess I said at the beginning, I talked about those three phases of American history. The national phase, from the Civil War down through World War II, where we created a nation. A lot of our patriotic things were done then. The national anthem is recognized, the Pledge of Allegiance is done then, America the Beautiful is written then. A lot of our patriotic themes are developed in that period of those wars. And I think those wars probably helped to assimilate the immigrants who came in that period. they fought in the wars. If you fought in the war or got injured or killed, you're an American. So I think that was a factor. So if we come to the end of that, my sense, I can't prove this, I don't have a dogmatic view of it, is that our sense of nationality is unwinding. Now, Professor Allen talked about the American character, an enduring character. Is that at risk? Is that kind of coming apart as a consequence of these events that we've just discussed? Is our sense of nationality, pride in nation, sense that we're all in this together, is this kind of eroding? It was put together through a series of wars, as I said, but Cold War is over. Nobody's going to invade the United States. We don't have any enemies out there except ourselves. So is there a kind of an attrition going on in our national feeling, and that's a kind of a natural result of these events that we've just described as these decades pass by and there's nothing to reinforce our national feeling, and we have no enemies outside, and we begin to turn on one another as enemies. That's a worrisome thought, and with that, I'll close, because as I said, I don't have a dogmatic view of this. I see a significant problem out there. The university as a whole, another problem, which is reflective of some of the things that I've mentioned. So I think, is this a counsel of doom that I've given you? No, not at all. I think if we're aware of what's happening to us, maybe we can intervene and do something. A lot of people don't go to the doctor because they're afraid the doctor will find out that they're sick. Well, they're not going to be any less sick if they don't go to the doctor. So we're better off knowing what's happening to us. And I've tried to describe some of these things. Others might have a different take on it, but I'm throwing this out to you to think about. I've tried to give you a lot of information and facts out there to help you frame your own thoughts. But with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll stop. Thank you.
Many thanks, many thanks. So we're now going to go directly into a question period, and we'll ask you to raise your hands, and we'll raise the mic around to you. So let's see, we're going to start with undergraduates. If I have any break there, we are right there to very back. Thank you.
Yes, fine, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time. Really appreciated it. What would you say to someone studying political science in 2019, as I am right now?
What would I say to you? What would I advise you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you ever hear of a man named Larry Sabato? He's on TV. He's an excellent election expert. He's a political scientist at the University of Virginia. There's just a story, not apropos of anything. And he says, many years ago, a student came up to him and said, I want to study political science. And Larry Sabato, who was a political scientist, said, in that case, you ought to study abnormal psychology. That's not what I'm going to advise you to do. Well, look, you have some great teachers here, Professor Allen, Professor Presser's here. You should take courses with them. I think that if you know your history, I think that's really important. Know the history, know the institutions, know the Constitution, understand the Founding Fathers, understand what they were up against and what they tried to do. The great statesmen and the great events, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. Know all about that. I know that they teach you a lot of numbers and public opinion in political science departments because I used to be a student myself. But that's where I would look. I would read the great speeches, know why the Constitution was written, what's in it, what have been the great challenges to it, what have been the great events. Those are the things you need to know to understand politics and to be an enlightened citizen. Now, I assume you're not going to become a political scientist. I wouldn't advise that. Look, I think it's hard I used to be an academic. I think it's hard to get a good education today because I'm not sure that these fundamentals are taught to the degree they should be. And the student has to be a very intelligent consumer to learn the things he or she needs to know. So, you got to study your courses, study your professors, and go into courses where you're learning something worthwhile. And not all students are aware of that. They don't know how to do that. If they do, they're fortunate. If they have an adult, like a parent or something like that, who's able to guide them, that's very good. So that's what I would suggest, which is study the basics. I've tried to do some of that here. So that's what I would advise.
I'm taking an undergraduate course, so maybe that qualifies me. Can I test the theory that you just stimulated? Could you go back about 5 or 6 slides to the quadrant that you showed?
Okay, you mean, I see.
Almost there. Would you, as a political scientist advisor, would you suggest to both parties that they should focus on potential voters because there's such a large independent base up in the left-hand quadrant, and who are they?
That's a good question. I think that's where Trump won the election. Trump won the election on those voters who are in that quadrant. They're both economically somewhat liberal, but culturally conservative. Those are those working class voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, who believe that the government should be active in preserving their jobs and maintaining Medicare and Social Security, but they don't like the cultural radicalism that they see in the Democratic Party.
Is that the people that Walter Russell Mead writes about with the Jacksonian Revolution?
Yes, I would say that would be that group. That would be that group. Now, I don't know if the people in that group is increasing or not. You'd have to kind of see this over time. But I think obviously down in this lower left-hand corner, there's a lot of concentration of votes there. That's hardcore Democrat vote. That's economic liberalism and cultural liberalism. But not enough to win an election. So yeah, I would agree with you. As you see, that Trump has a lot of them on the left-hand side of that quadrant. Trump got a lot of votes there. So he saw that's where the election is going to be won. So that would be the so-called Jacksonian vote. Yeah, that's an interesting chart, I think. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Given the history that you have outlined and the polarization, would you care to...
There's a mic right there.
Oh, okay. Given the history that you have presented to us, which was very interesting, and the polarization going on, clear for anyone, any thinking person, do you have, and would you be willing to make any prognostications about what's going to happen in 2020?
Well, it's always dangerous to make those predictions because I never thought Donald Trump could ever win a national election. Actually, nobody I know felt that Donald Trump could win the election. There are people in retrospect who came out and said, I knew it, but I don't know that I heard them say that in advance. So in 2020, Trump is going to run, it looks like. And a lot of things could happen between now and the election. He has a good economy, full employment, basically. The United States is at peace. It's very hard to beat an incumbent president who has peace and prosperity, because that's what he'll campaign on. It's hard to think of any incumbent president who's lost in the circumstance of peace and prosperity. All those who've lost, like Jimmy Carter, had messes on their hands of one kind or another, George H.W. Bush. So Trump, right now, looks to be in pretty good position. He won't be challenged, I don't think, seriously in a Republican primary. He'll have a lot of money, and he'll have a record to campaign on, which he didn't have before. So then the Democrats, what are they going to do with these 15 or 20 candidates who are running? And, you know, if they're lucky, they'll get a semi-moderate candidate. But I think it's a crapshoot to get that candidate. It looks like it's going to be one of these candidates who's endorsed the Green New Deal or Medicare for All or any one of these programs that are very expensive and way out on the left. So a lot of them have endorsed this. What has happened because of these freshman members of Congress have come in and said Green New Deal and Medicare for All and all that, and they've all had to sign on, which they've done. So, you know, Trump will probably hang that around their necks in the campaign. So if you had to handicap it now, you'd say that Trump is in pretty good position. He is a polarizing figure. He's not going to get 55%. He could get 51 or 52% against the right candidate. But, you know, things can change. Something could happen in the economy that would cause some trouble. Or the Democrats could nominate a very compelling figure. Now, I have to say, looking at that field, I don't see that compelling figure out there. So the strongest ones seem to be out on the left that would be vulnerable to Trump's attacks. I think it would be a nasty race, a lot of name calling. You may not have a debate. Trump may say, I'm not debating because some of the things you've said about me, and I don't want to appear on this. I don't want to have people from NBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post asking me questions. So he may just bag the debates. And so that will be another breaking of the norms, so to speak. So I think it'll be a nasty race. Trump is in a pretty good position. Trump has learned that he succeeds by polarization. So I think that's kind of why I say, and the Democrats, as often happens with the out party, have a free-for-all on their hands.
I understand why you say it's a contentious period, but there have been periods of greater contention in the United States.
I talked about the 60s, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
With, you know, the bombings and the riots and the fires and the cities and that type of thing. The Civil War, obviously, too.
We don't want that.
I know. But to me, it seems that the founders were very prescient, reading what they talked about and why they set up the Electoral College. I think that is the biggest issue right now, because if you're only if you only have to win the popular vote, then you have much greater control. So I just would like your comments on that.
Well, your point is that we've had bigger problems in the past, and given the way that we set up our institutions, we can get through this. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. You know, on the other side, I might say something like this. But we've talked about the polarization. You know, one question I'd have, which is a deep question, and you can have your professors think about it. Does a constitution, a set of rules, work in a system in which people really don't like one another? So do you need a nation in order for a set of rules like the Constitution to work? By a nation, people who are more or less aligned with one another, share a common culture, and their fates are interconnected, and they believe they have to protect one another's interest in one way or another. That's a nation. And the United States has been a nation in that sense. But what if people, as I said, really don't like one another, and they think if the other guys win, all their basic interests are going to go down the drain? Are they going to follow the rules? Are they going to break the rules? That happened in 1860. So one side said, you know, when you've elected Abraham Lincoln, this is a fundamental threat to us, and we're not going to stay in the same system. So, I think when you get this polarity, you begin to get people saying things like, let's get rid of the Supreme Court, let's pack the Supreme Court, let's get rid of the Electoral College. Who cares about the Constitution? If we can't win, we don't care. These rules have to be set up so we win, and if they're not, we need to get rid of them. So I would say that. And I do agree with you. I don't know what we're fighting about. We could talk about that as opposed to civil war. But in 1914, Europe went to war. Why? What were the underlying causes of that war? It was almost entirely political. There were no depressions. John Maynard Keynes wrote about that period and said, this was a glorious time, 1914. The countries are trading with one another. Germany and Great Britain were trading partners. In fact, the monarchs were all interrelated. The King of England was from the same family as the German Kaiser. And they went to war. They destroyed their civilization. And they weren't content with just doing it once, they did it again. For reasons that are very difficult to comprehend. My point, people can do stupid things. And they can destroy their country by doing stupid things that they can't take back.
One follow-up to that, do you think social media has had
Yeah.
an impact on this?
No question. But being an old guy, I don't know anything about it, but there's no question that the Twitter mobs and all this stuff contribute to polarization because you can't have a debate. You say something, people don't say, well, that's interesting, let me come back. They say, you're done. We're ostracizing you. So you get all of that. Another thing that's happened as a consequence of the 1960s and the Great Society, which I didn't remark on, which could be remarked on, when Johnson passed all these programs, I just scratched the surface on the stuff that he did, all these new programs. All the energy went to Washington, and interest groups formed around every program, ideological groups. So there are now groups in Washington whose job it is to lobby judicial appointments. They lobby the EPA about environmental regulations. They lobby the Labor Department about this. They're in everywhere. They lobby the FTC and all the regulatory bodies, and they have associations with the national press. They had a problem, they can get a story planted. They have contacts with the congressional committees. So, and it's all polarizing. If you see what the Democrats are saying about these judicial nominees, it's all fed to them by these interest groups that have been set up, all way out on the left. There's some on the right as well that have been developed in response to that. Now, the great mass of the public is not paying attention to this. So, I mean, I think if you took a cross-section of this community, they say, well, there's no point in going to civil war over these differences. It doesn't mean it. But if you go into Washington, they're ready to go to war, partly for this reason. Now, some of my friends say, don't worry about it, the country's fine. But again, the leaders can begin to do things that can't be taken back and can drag us down the path to, a terrible situation.
And this will be a quick one, I hope. I thought that was an absolutely dazzling presentation. The one thing that I wondered about is the cause of this shattered consensus and whether you can push it back a little further into the past than you did. And in short, I wonder if it's not the Warren Court's fault. I
think we could have a good debate about that. And I didn't mention the Warren Court because obviously that's a huge aspect of the 1960s. You go through all their cases that they did, not just school desegregation, but pornography and libel and reapportionment, prayer in schools, whole series of things. I guess I would say I'd throw that into the matrix of those events of the 60s. And the Warren Court is a huge part of it. Here we had a situation where the culture was pressing in a certain direction. By culture, I mean movies and music and all that. That was going in a certain direction. The politics, Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society and JFK, that's all going in a common direction. And now the courts are aggressively going in a common direction. So there wasn't that much pushback in the 1960s. So they took this thing a long way in the 1960s in terms of reform and revolution in the 60s. I totally agree with that. I've been thinking about the role of the Warren Court. You know so much more about it than I do. I don't know that much about it. I've looked at these cases. One thing I'd say about the Warren Court, you can correct me here and you can look at this, a lot of those decisions were directed against the South. So, I would say this. We made an effort. I talked about the building of a nation in that period. What we tried to do in the 50s and 60s was to complete the nation building by bringing the South into the national system. Because of their racial policies, the South was so far out of the national mainstream, we'd never brought them into the nation. And the Warren Court tried to do that. So did the Civil Rights Acts and the Great Society to some degree. I think they did succeed in bringing the South into the nation in a fashion, but with a lot of costs on the other side, as you know very well. So, that's the Warren. Now, the Warren Court is a huge thing that happened in America. As you know, there's never been anything like it in the history of the United States and the history of the courts. And it still continues with a great deal of momentum today.
I want to thank you, Jim, and I invite everyone to join me. I know we could go on for a long time, but...
Thank you.
If you have remaining questions, he will still have a few moments. There is a reception outside the doors here, and he will be there to entertain your questions as you continue to engage him. But thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here. We
Thank you.
enjoyed
Glad
this.
to be here.